So I'd like to talk a little bit about the use of language in non-human primates like Coco the gorilla shown here, or Washoe, Tatu, or Lulis chimpanzees. And so sometimes people start to get a little bristly at this idea that non-human primates are able to use human language. And I want to point out that, as we've already talked about, I want to reiterate that it's not quite the same thing. So humans have this kind of innate ability to use language. We've developed language on our own, and chimpanzees and gorillas have not done this. So chimpanzees and gorillas do have a system of symbols that they use, or hand gestures that they use. So this is a normal gesture for chimpanzees. They go like this, with an extended hand palm up, and go like this, or they're requesting food. That's a normal symbol. There's also symbols where a mother chimpanzee will hold her hand like this near her back to suggest that an infant or a young chimpanzee climb on her back. So they have these kind of symbols or hand gestures that they use naturally, but it's not quite the same as human language, right? These are symbols that mean something, but it's not to the extent of human language. And then, again, it's a closed system, so they're not generally combining these readily into other signs or other symbols. So it's pretty static in the way that it's used. And while they are symbols that are conveying meaning, it's a much more closed system and not really as adaptable as human language. And again, they're not using this language, or these symbols, excuse me, to communicate about past events or future events or things that don't exist immediately in their current environment. Okay, and so really the difference is that humans have this kind of ability naturally, whereas we're teaching chimpanzees and gorillas to use sign language, it's not something they would have done on their own. Okay, so there's kind of the big difference. And really what these language studies suggest is, one, the intelligence and learning capabilities of these animals, and two, it shows that the basis for language and the evolutionary history of language starts with our common ancestor, as opposed to starting somewhere between the common ancestor of great apes and humans. It doesn't start kind of in between there. That ancestor had some sort of language capability or propensity toward language. Okay, and so I do like to talk about these studies in this class for the reasons I've mentioned before, but to kind of show you about how language can be used outside of human context, and because it is something that we can study as anthropologists, specifically within primatology. Okay, so the first attempts to get a non-human primate to use a human language failed miserably, and that's because they were trying to get Vicky, a chimpanzee, to speak a human language, so speak English. And like we've talked about, they don't physically have the ability to do that. The sounds they make, they aren't capable of using their mouth and their vocal cords the same way humans are. They're not built the same way. So she was unable to do this. And through years of kind of raising her as their child, Vicky was only able to kind of half communicate the words cup and up, but that was it, and they sounded kind of like instead of actually like cup. And so this failed miserably. There were other attempts to teach chimpanzees or gorillas human language, spoken language. Part of the issue with this is they're treating the animals like study subjects, locking them in cages, bringing them out for lessons, putting them back in the cage alone. One of the breakthroughs in chimpanzee communication studies was to begin treating the ape like a human child, and what that's called cross-fostering, so raising a non-human as a human. And the reason for this, as you can probably imagine, was if we're trying to suggest that chimpanzees don't have the ability to acquire language like humans, but we treat them totally different than we would treat a human child in the same situation, you're not really making a comparison. If you're doing an experiment, you want to have one variable. The variable in this case should be the animal. So it should be the difference should be between a human child or a chimpanzee child, not in terms of how it's raised, how it's talked to, how it's treated. The difference should only be in the species, not in the way it is treated. So they started raising a chimpanzee named Washoe as a human child, as much as possible. So she never ate off the floor. She ate with a fork. She lived, she had a trailer she lived in, so she would sleep alone, but other than that, she was with a human. And they treated her like a human child. She wore diapers, she wore clothes, she learned to use the toilet, she went in the car, she wore her seatbelt. So she did all of these things as you might treat a human child. The point, again, was just to have everything be the same across raising a human child and raising a chimpanzee to try to learn language. The other thing they did with her was they didn't try to teach her to speak. They chose a non-vocal language. They chose American Sign Language. And so in front of Washoe, they didn't speak vocally at all. They only used sign language. So her caretakers, who were graduate students at the time, but one of whom was Roger Fouts, so they didn't speak at all. They only used sign language, and so they were teaching her sign language, much the way you teach a deaf child or a child sign language through a variety of processes of molding and moving her hands the way they needed to. So babies and chimpanzees want their hands together, so you would pull their hands apart when they brought them together, give them more food. This is the sign for more. So they would use molding and things like that and showing the chimpanzees how to make the signs. And so using these methods of treating the chimpanzee like a human child and teaching them language, sign language that way, was actually much more successful. And so Washoe knew hundreds of signs. And so then they began expanding the experiments, and they expanded it to a full family group, which included Tatu and Dar. Dar has since passed away. Tatu is still living at the sanctuary I worked at in Canada, or interned at in Canada. And then eventually, to kind of continue the experiment, they wanted to see if Washoe would pass on language to an infant chimpanzee. So your textbook talks about the spreading of language from generation to generation and through tradition and teaching language, as opposed to instinctual communication forms like call systems. And so what they did is, eventually Washoe was able to adopt a chimpanzee whom they named they named Lulis. And so Lulis was her adopted son, and they didn't sign around Lulis except for a few key signs, so I think who, what, when, where. And besides that, the humans didn't sign around Lulis. He didn't actually really learn those signs very well. What he did learn were things that Washoe specifically taught him. So she brought him, for example, a chair, set the chair in front of him and signed chair. Touches the chair, signs chair. Puts him in the chair, signs chair. So she actually brought the object to him, showed it to him, and then showed him the sign. She would do other things like he didn't want to hug her, so, or this is the sign, hug love. It's also a normal chimpanzee gesture, but it's the sign for hug/love that they use in chimpanzee sign language. And so he didn't want to do that, and so she'd sign it and he wouldn't do anything. So then she'd grab him, she'd sign it, and then she'd grab him and pull him close, and eventually she got frustrated, and so she scared him, so he jumped into her arms. She signs it, and then after that he understood. But she actually taught him sign language. So instead of him being taught by another human, she intentionally taught him these signs and taught him this language. And so these are just a few examples showing you the intentionality behind language use in these animals, and a little bit anecdotal, but the research is sound and shouldn't be dismissed in any right. And so I'm going to have for you the next few videos if you're taking the class. In the class, online class, we'll have some videos showing you language use among these animals. Some of them are sad, some of them are heart-wrenching, some of them are funny, and I think all of those things are important when you're talking about the ability to use language. A couple anecdotal ones. I saw a chimpanzee and a human argue about moving. So the caretaker was saying to Tatu that we needed to clean where she was sitting in the enclosure, and she didn't want to move. And so she said no, and the caretaker said, can you move? We need to clean here. And she said, no, I'll stay. And so the woman says, Tatu, we need to clean, you have to move. And she's signing all of this. And Tatu says, give cheese. And cheese is her favorite thing. And Kaylee signs, if I give you cheese, will you move? Or something to that effect. And Tatu says, get cheese, or want cheese. And so the caretaker says, okay, I'll go get your cheese, but you have to move. And she signs cheese again, and she kind of gets up and moves and went somewhere else. And then waited for her cheese, which she anxiously made food grunts for, as she was excited to get her cheese. So the ability to use language is there. The difference is just that it isn't a naturally occurring thing with chimpanzees that they use language to this degree. The important part is that they do have the ability to use this language, and then also to pass this language on and share the language. Additionally, in the textbook mentions this, but gorillas and chimpanzees will combine signs. So Coco, the gorilla there, you can see her, she didn't know the sign for watermelon, or they gave her watermelon and didn't tell her the name of it, and so she called it liquid fruit. And then I think it was Washa didn't know the sign for duck, so she combined it to say waterbird. And so this kind of takes that very closed language system and begins to open it a little bit and show some flexibility in their use of language and their understanding of language. So knowing that they could combine two descriptive words into one, and then they will consistently call that animal, the duck, a waterbird, or watermelon, liquid fruit. And so this is showing that they do have kind of an ability to acquire an open language system. And I just think the studies are really interesting. So make sure you watch the videos below, answer the questions, and feel free to shoot me an email or comment below if you have any additional questions.